took the mansion, the investment accounts, and every single dollar they had built over 48 years. But what Arthur didn't realize as he walked away from his 74-year-old wife without looking back was that his lawyers had overlooked the smallest, most forgotten piece of her life. The one hidden thing that would make everything he took completely meaningless in the end. The ink on the final decree dried in less than 10 seconds. 48 years of marriage ceased to exist. Eleanor watched the lawyer cap his silver fountain pen. The sharp click echoed in the silent conference room. Arthur sat directly across the polished mahogany table. He kept his gaze fixed on a spot just above her left shoulder. He wore his bespoke charcoal suit. It was the exact suit she had picked up from the dry cleaners 3 days ago. A thick stack of documents lay between them. It was a masterpiece of corporate law. Arthur had spent the last decade quietly restructuring their assets. Every property, every investment portfolio, and every savings account had been transferred into a complex web of offshore holding companies. Eleanor had signed the proxy forms blindly over the years. She had believed they were standard tax optimization procedures. They were actually the architecture of her ruin. The settlement was brutally simple. Arthur retained absolute ownership of the estate. Eleanor received a nominal severance. It was barely enough to cover 2 months of cheap rent. The legal justification was airtight. She had no independent income. She had sacrificed her career in architecture at age 26 to raise their children and manage the household. The court viewed her domestic labor as a non-financial contribution. It carried zero weight against Arthur's aggressive corporate maneuvers. The physical eviction began exactly 48 hours later. A white commercial van parked in the circular driveway. 2 men in gray polo shirts stepped out. They carried digital tablets and barcode scanners. They were not malicious. They were simply efficient. The lead agent handed Eleanor a printed notice. She had exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. She walked into the grand foyer. The Italian marble felt cold beneath her shoes. She had chosen those specific tiles during a trip to Verona in 1982. Now, a man was sticking a yellow barcode label onto the antique console table. The house was no longer a home. It was an inventory list. Eleanor climbed the curved staircase. She did not rush. Panic requires energy. She felt only a profound, hollow clarity. She entered the master bedroom. The walk-in closet was larger than most studio apartments. She pulled a single leather suitcase from the top shelf. The mandate was strict. She could only take personal clothing and basic hygiene necessities. Valuables, jewelry gifted during the marriage, and electronics remained part of the disputed corporate estate. She packed methodically. 3 pairs of dark trousers, 5 cotton blouses, 2 heavy wool cardigans. She bypassed the silk evening gowns. She ignored the cashmere coats. They belonged to the wife of a wealthy executive. That woman no longer existed. She reached for her pearl necklace. Her fingers brushed the gold clasp. She stopped. She left it in the velvet box. It was a battle she could not afford to fight today. Downstairs, the systematic dismantling of her life accelerated. The sharp tear of packing tape sliced through the quiet afternoon. Movers wrapped the dining chairs in thick industrial plastic. Those chairs had seated ambassadors, clients, and her own family during countless Thanksgiving dinners. Now, they were just assets, waiting for an auction house appraisal. Arthur was absent. He had scheduled a board meeting in London. The timing was deliberate. It allowed him to avoid the messy reality of his betrayal. He preferred spreadsheets to human consequences. Their grown children were scattered across the globe, fully dependent on their father's trust funds. They had chosen their side of the ledger. The lead agent tapped his watch. The 2 hours had evaporated. Eleanor snapped the brass locks on her suitcase. She walked down the hallway for the last time. She did not look back at the framed photographs. She did not touch the walls. She stepped out the front door. The heavy oak swung shut. The automatic lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud. She stood on the bluestone porch. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves. She opened her leather purse. Inside lay her passport, a driver's license, and exactly $55 in cash. Her joint credit cards had been deactivated at midnight. Her mobile phone service was scheduled to be cut off by evening. The driveway stretched out toward the main road. It was empty. Her sedan was registered to Arthur's primary corporation. The movers had already taken the keys. She gripped the handle of her suitcase. The nearest bus stop was 3 miles away. The sky above the bare oak trees turned a bruised purple. The temperature was dropping fast. She had lost her history, her shelter, and her financial identity in a single afternoon. The descent was absolute. The cold reality of the pavement waited beneath her feet. Eleanor folded the last cashmere sweater into the cardboard box. 48 years of marriage were now reduced to 3 suitcases and a stack of court orders. Arthur's legal team had executed a flawless extraction. They claimed the primary residence, the investment portfolios, and the vehicles. She was given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. The final settlement left her with a modest monthly stipend and her personal effects. Everything else belonged to her ex-husband. She walked toward the master bedroom closet for a final sweep. On the top shelf, pushed far into the darkest corner, sat a scuffed leather sewing box. It was a heavy, cylindrical antique from her early 20s. Arthur had always despised it. He preferred modern, minimalist design and sterile surfaces. He had often suggested throwing it away. Eleanor pulled the box down and set it on the bed. The leather was dry and cracking at the seams. She removed the spools of thread and the rusted needles. She ran her fingers along the wooden base and pressed a concealed latch. A false bottom dropped open with a soft click. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in dark green velvet. Eleanor carefully unfolded the fabric. A heavy brass key rested in the center of her palm. The metal was cold, its surface darkened by decades of oxidation. The teeth were cut in an intricate, archaic pattern. Arthur never knew about this key. Throughout their nearly 5 decades together, he never inquired about her life before their wedding. He operated on the assumption that her existence began the day they met. He required total transparency from her, managing every aspect of their shared life. Yet, she had maintained this single, deliberate blind spot. The key belonged to an inheritance she had intentionally excluded from their prenuptial agreements. It was a quiet, lifelong rebellion against his need for absolute control. The brass object unlocked a very specific door. 200 miles north, nestled deep within the Blackwood Valley, stood a small stone cottage. Eleanor's grandmother had transferred the title to her exactly 50 years ago. The deed remained registered under her maiden name. Arthur's aggressive forensic accountants had missed it entirely. They were hunting for offshore accounts, hidden stock options, and shell companies. They did not look for abandoned, off-grid rural acreage with zero market liquidity. Eleanor closed her fingers around the metal. The sharp edges pressed into her skin, grounding her in the present moment. The crushing weight of the eviction began to lift. The intimidating legal documents on the mahogany dining table suddenly lost their power. She was not a discarded wife being pushed into the unknown. She was a property owner holding the means to her own sanctuary. Memories of the valley surfaced with sudden clarity. She remembered the dense canopy of ancient pine trees shielding the property from the main road. She recalled the absolute silence of the surrounding woods, broken only by the flow of a nearby creek. The cottage had been empty for half a century. It lacked electricity and indoor plumbing. The slate roof likely needed extensive repairs. The surrounding garden was undoubtedly swallowed by wild brambles and invasive vines. None of that mattered. It represented absolute, unassailable security. No bank held a mortgage on those thick stone walls. No corporate lawyer could draft a document to seize the land. The property existed entirely outside the ecosystem of Arthur's wealth and influence. It was a fortress built of stone and legal obscurity. Eleanor dropped the key into her coat pocket. She zipped her final suitcase with a sharp, decisive motion. The luxurious house around her suddenly felt hollow and irrelevant. The expensive art on the walls and the imported silk rugs on the floors were just props in a play that had finally ended. She picked up her bags. She walked out the front door and let it lock behind her. Her journey was no longer a forced retreat. It was a deliberate return to a place where her past was waiting to secure her future. The bus left Eleanor at the edge of a forgotten county line. The ticket had cost her $28. She now had exactly $27 and a rusted key to her name. She stepped off the asphalt onto a dirt path. Pine needles muffled her footsteps. Decades had passed since her last visit. Nature reclaims abandoned things quickly. Saplings had grown into thick barriers. Brambles choked the old logging trail. She pushed through the undergrowth. Her breath came in short bursts. A single thought drove her forward. Wood rots. Roofs cave in under heavy winter snows. The refuge might be nothing more than a pile of mossy timber. The tree line broke. A small clearing opened up near the bend of the creek. The structure stood there. It leaned slightly to the west. The cedar shingles were gray and curled at the edges. Yet, the walls held firm. The stone chimney remained completely intact. Ivy had crawled up the northern side, anchoring the logs to the earth. It was not a ruin. It was a fortress disguised as decay. Eleanor approached the heavy oak door. The brass padlock was green with oxidation. She inserted the key. The metal ground against metal. It required both hands to turn. The mechanism clicked. The padlock fell away. She pushed the iron latch. The door swung inward. Stale air rushed out. It smelled of dried pine resin and old paper. She stepped over the threshold. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight, piercing the grimy window. Time had stopped in this room 40 years ago. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner. A stack of chopped wood waited neatly beside it. The bark was dry and brittle. A heavy wooden table occupied the center. 2 chairs were pushed in. Everything remained exactly as her grandfather had left it. Eleanor ran her hand along the table's edge. The wood was solid. It did not bend. It did not negotiate. Over the past 3 weeks, her entire life had been dismantled by pieces of paper. Signatures, stamps, and eviction notices had erased 48 years of marriage. Lawyers had divided her existence into columns of assets and liabilities. They took the house. They took the savings. They missed this. The deed to this single acre of land was never digitized. It existed only in a dusty county archive under a different surname. The legal machine could not touch what it could not see. The men in tailored suits possessed no jurisdiction here. Their court orders held no power over the thick pine logs. The forest recognized no subpoenas. She walked toward the back wall. A set of shelves held glass jars. Dried herbs inside had lost their color but kept their form. A kerosene lamp stood on the mantel. She picked it up. Liquid sloshed faintly inside. There was enough fuel for a few nights. The silence here was different from the silence of her empty city apartment. That was the silence of loss. This was the silence of anticipation. The cabin offered no modern comforts. There was no electricity. Running water meant carrying a bucket to the creek. The nights would be freezing, but it offered absolute sovereignty. Eleanor took off her coat. The autumn chill was sharp, but she felt a sudden surge of heat. She found an old broom in the corner. The bristles were stiff. She began to sweep. The physical labor grounded her. Each stroke cleared away decades of dust. It also pushed back the helplessness. The lawyers had dictated her schedule for months: court dates, depositions, deadlines to vacate. Here, the only clock was the sun moving across the floorboards. She gathered the swept dirt into a pile. She opened the door and pushed it outside. The wind carried it away. She inspected the cast-iron stove. The flue was clear. She crumpled a piece of dry moss and placed it inside. She struck a match from a tin box left on the mantel. The flame caught. The small fire crackled, casting a warm, orange glow against the dark wood. Smoke drew perfectly up the chimney. The cabin took its first breath in 4 decades. Eleanor moved to the sleeping area. A heavy quilt lay folded on the iron bed frame. It smelled musty but felt completely dry. The roof had not leaked. The craftsmanship of a forgotten era had protected the interior. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned. For the first time in a year, her shoulders dropped. The constant vigilance drained from her muscles. She was safe. Beneath the bed, a distinct shadow caught her eye. She knelt on the rough planks. Her knees ached from the damp cold of the floor. She reached under the metal frame. Her fingers brushed against cold brass. It was a heavy handle. She pulled. A large wooden trunk slid out into the light. The leather straps were cracked and brittle. The brass corners were heavily tarnished. A small, built-in lock secured the front latch. It was identical in make to the padlock on the front door. This was the true anchor of the cabin. The space had survived the elements. Now, she needed to see what had survived inside the chest. The rusty lock gave way with a dry snap. Eleanor lifted the heavy oak lid. The scent of dried sage and old parchment filled the dusty air. Inside lay no hidden wealth, no forgotten bank bonds, just a meticulous stack of leather-bound ledgers. Beside them rested over 50 small glass apothecary jars. Each jar held dormant life, seeds. Faded paper labels marked the harvest years: 1974, 1981. These were not commercial hybrids. They were resilient heirloom varieties. Their genetics were perfectly adapted to this harsh mountain climate. Eleanor opened the topmost ledger. The precise handwriting belonged to her mother, Clara. It contained no emotional confessions. It was a rigorous survival manual. Clara had documented the microclimate of the property. She recorded the exact frost dates for the past 3 decades. She mapped the soil acidity levels across the northern ridge. Eleanor turned the brittle pages. The ink laid out a masterclass in absolute self-reliance. One notebook held detailed architectural blueprints. They showed the hidden routing of the underground spring. Another ledger was dedicated entirely to preservation. It listed chemical-free methods for curing meat, fermenting vegetables, and storing root crops through sub-zero winters. A third book detailed the local flora. It categorized medicinal herbs, their peak harvest times, and extraction methods. A profound shift occurred in Eleanor's mind. For 48 years, she had outsourced her survival. She had relied on joint accounts, modern conveniences, and a husband who eventually erased her from his life. He had taken the glass-walled mansion. He had claimed the investment portfolios. He had left her this remote cabin as a cruel joke, a place to fade away. He had miscalculated. He had handed her the ultimate asset. Eleanor closed the ledger. The persistent tremor in her fingers ceased. The paralyzing fear of the approaching autumn dissolved. She was no longer a discarded asset in a divorce settlement. She was the sole operator of a proven, self-sustaining enterprise. The victim mentality evaporated. It was instantly replaced by cold, calculated purpose. The next morning started at 4 o'clock. Eleanor ignored the distant valley where her former life continued without her. She found heavy canvas overalls in a cedar wardrobe. They fit perfectly. Her first objective was securing a water source. Clara's hand-drawn diagrams led her straight to the overgrown ravine. The natural spring was not dry. It was merely choked by decades of accumulated debris and fallen shale. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor spent hours at a time submerged in freezing mud. She moved heavy stones with a rusted iron pry bar, pushing her 74-year-old body to its absolute limits. Finally, she cleared the blockage. Clear glacial water surged forward, filling the old stone catchment basin. She drank directly from her cupped hands. The water tasted of minerals and earth. It was the taste of autonomy. Returning to the cabin, she organized the seed bank. Black mountain tomatoes, bush beans, winter squash, hardy rye. These seeds had waited in the dark for over 30 years. They required immediate action. Eleanor retrieved a heavy mattock from the collapsed lean-to. She walked to the southern exposure. The ground was compacted and unforgiving. She drove the steel blade into the turf. The impact sent a shockwave up her arms. Muscles unaccustomed to manual labor screamed in protest. Blisters immediately formed on her soft palms. She did not pause. Every strike of the tool broke the soil, and every strike simultaneously severed another psychological chain to her past. She was dismantling her old identity with every swing. It took a grueling week of relentless, back-breaking labor, but eventually, a quarter-acre of dark, rich loam lay exposed. Eleanor planted the first rows of beans and squash. She followed Clara's companion, planting diagrams to the millimeter. This was not a recreational garden. This was her primary food source. This was the foundation of her new economy. As dusk approached, she turned her attention to the cabin's integrity. The western roofline showed signs of rot. Clara's journals included a guide to splitting cedar shingles using hand tools. Eleanor located the antique froe and a heavy wooden mallet. She positioned the blade on a seasoned cedar block. She struck the mallet. The wood split cleanly, releasing a sharp, resinous aroma. She repeated the process 20 times. She had her first batch of roofing materials. Night fell completely. Eleanor lit a single oil lamp. She sat at the rough-hewn dining table. Her body ached with a deep, unfamiliar exhaustion. Yet, her mind operated with absolute clarity. She opened the medicinal ledger. It detailed formulas for pine resin salves and willow bark tinctures. These were high-value items, goods she could eventually trade or sell in the valley town. She began to draft a timeline. She calculated the days until the first hard freeze. She measured the potential caloric yield of the garden against her winter requirements. She estimated the volume of firewood needed to maintain a constant indoor temperature. The mathematics were stark. The margin for error was 0. But the entire equation was firmly in her hands. Before sleeping, Eleanor prepared her tools for the next day. She sharpened the hoe with a whetstone. She oiled the wooden handles with linseed oil found in the cellar. Maintenance was the first rule of survival listed in Clara's book. A dull tool wasted energy. Energy was her most precious currency. She laid out her canvas clothes. She set a mechanical alarm clock for 3 a.m. The silence of the mountain was no longer oppressive. It was a blank canvas. She closed her eyes, her mind already visualizing the architecture of the root cellar she would begin digging at dawn. A weathered pine plank rested across 2 oak barrels on the gravel shoulder of County Road 9. This was the storefront. Eleanor placed 6 glass jars on the rough wood. They contained a dark, amber preserve made from wild elderberries and spruce tips. The recipe belonged to her mother. It had slept in a leather-bound journal for over 5 decades. Now, it was Eleanor's first offering to the world. The forest road saw little traffic. Perhaps 10 cars passed in an hour. Eleanor sat on a folding chair in the shade of a massive elm. She did not wave at the passing vehicles. She simply waited. The morning sun climbed higher, baking the asphalt. Doubt crept in. The idea of selling wild preserves seemed foolish in the harsh daylight. Then, a rusted pickup truck slowed down. The tires crunched on the gravel. A man in mud-stained overalls stepped out. He looked at the jars. He unscrewed a sample jar and tasted the dark jam. His eyes widened. He bought 3 jars without haggling. He handed over $30 in crumpled bills. Those $30 were a revelation. They were not an allowance from a husband. They were not a pity handout. They were the direct result of Eleanor's own labor. The physical work had transformed her. The first few weeks at the cabin had been brutal. Her joints ached from hauling water. Her hands blistered from clearing the overgrown garden. She had spent 48 years in climate-controlled rooms. The wilderness demanded sweat. But the pain was honest. It was the ache of muscles waking up from a long sleep. She learned to read the forest. The woods were not empty space. They were a vast, untamed pantry. She harvested dandelion roots in the early spring. She gathered chanterelles after the summer rains. She picked wild rose hips before the first frost. Each season dictated her schedule. Nature became her employer. It was a fair boss. It rewarded hard work with absolute abundance. The roadside stand grew. The pine plank was replaced by a sturdy wooden pavilion. Eleanor built it herself, hammering every nail. The inventory expanded. Beside the elderberry preserve stood rows of pickled ramps, dried medicinal herbs, and jars of raw honey from wild hives. Word of mouth is a powerful currency in rural counties. The man in the pickup truck told his neighbors. The neighbors told their friends. Cars began to make deliberate detours down County Road 9. People came for the preserves. They stayed for the atmosphere. Eleanor became a fixture of the landscape. Customers saw a woman with sun-weathered skin and strong, capable hands. They did not see a discarded wife. They saw a master of her craft. They asked for her advice on gardening. They sought her remedies for winter colds. She listened, nodded, and offered quiet wisdom. Her social circle rebuilt itself organically. It was no longer based on country club memberships. It was not tied to her ex-husband's business partners. It was rooted in mutual respect. A local baker started buying her fruit compotes in bulk. A cafe owner in the nearest town offered shelf space for her herbal teas. Eleanor declined the retail offer. She preferred the direct exchange at the edge of the woods. It kept her grounded. The financial recovery was steady. A glass jar sold for $10. 10 jars bought winter firewood. 50 jars paid the annual property tax on the cabin. Eleanor kept a ledger in a simple notebook. The columns of numbers were small, yet they represented complete freedom. No lawyers could touch this income. No court order could seize the knowledge in her head. She established a strict routine. Dawn brought the harvest. Midday was for boiling, sterilizing, and sealing. Late afternoon belonged to the roadside stand. The evenings were reserved for the ledger and her mother's journals. The silence of the cabin was no longer intimidating. It was a blank canvas. Autumn arrived. It painted the forest in shades of copper and gold. Eleanor stood behind her pavilion. The air was crisp. A line of 4 cars was parked on the shoulder. Customers chatted amiably while waiting their turn. She handed over a jar of pickled mushrooms to a young mother. She counted the change. Eleanor looked at her hands. The manicured nails of her past life were gone. Her fingers were stained with berry juice and earth. Calluses protected her palms. She felt a profound sense of ownership over her own body. She had forged it into a tool of survival and creation. The roadside venture was no longer an experiment. It was a thriving microeconomy. More importantly, it was a fortress. Eleanor had built a life that required no permission to exist. The forest provided the raw materials. Her hands provided the labor. The passing road provided the market. She closed the stand at twilight. She packed the remaining jars into a wooden crate. The day's earnings sat heavy in her canvas apron. She walked up the dirt path toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. The windows glowed with warm, yellow light. She had created a sanctuary from the ruins of her past. The triumph was entirely silent. It required no applause. It only required the deep, unshakable knowledge that she could finally stand on her own. The October air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and crushed apples. Eleanor stood by the edge of the orchard. She wiped dark earth from her hands onto a heavy canvas apron. The gravel on the main road crunched under the weight of tires. A silver sedan rolled to a stop at the boundary of her property. The engine died. A man stepped out into the autumn chill. It was Arthur. He wore a tailored cashmere coat. The expensive fabric hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His shoulders sloped forward. The aggressive, confident stride of a man who spent his life dictating terms in glass boardrooms had vanished. He stood by the open car door. He stared at the restored timber frame of the main cabin. He looked at the neat, endless rows of winter wheat. He did not recognize the landscape. He did not recognize the woman standing before him. Eleanor did not move to greet him. She waited. Arthur walked up the dirt path. His polished leather shoes collected gray dust with every step. He stopped 3 paces away. He looked older than his 72 years. The deep lines around his mouth spoke of recent, heavy defeats. "You built a fortress here," he said. His voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It sounded thin in the open air. "I unearthed a foundation," Eleanor replied. He looked down at his dusty shoes. "The venture capital firm restructured. My partners forced a buyout. The new accounts were frozen." He paused, swallowing hard. Evelyn left. The townhouse is being liquidated by the bank. He was delivering a damage report. It was an old habit. He was waiting for a reaction. He expected pity. He expected residual anger. He perhaps even expected the bitter satisfaction of a wronged spouse. Eleanor offered absolutely nothing. She observed him with the calm detachment of a botanist studying a blighted leaf. The silence stretched between them. The wind rustled the dry oak leaves above. 48 years, Eleanor," he said softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "We shared nearly 5 decades. We built a life together. I made a profound error in judgment, a terrible miscalculation. I have lost everything. I have nowhere else to go." He reached out his right hand. His fingers trembled slightly. Eleanor looked at his outstretched palm. She remembered the day a courier handed her the eviction notice. She remembered the cold, legal precision of his attorneys. She remembered the feeling of being erased from her own life. That memory held no pain anymore. It was merely a historical fact. It was like the first frost that inevitably kills the weak summer vines. "Our marriage was a contract written on paper," she said. Her tone was even. "You chose to shred it. I found solid stone underneath the scraps." Arthur slowly dropped his hand. The rejection hit him physically. He seemed to shrink further into his coat. "I am asking for grace," he pleaded. "I am asking to come home." "This is not your home," Eleanor stated. The words were flat. They were completely devoid of malice. "This land belongs to my mother's lineage. It belongs to the calluses on my hands. It belongs to the seeds in the soil. You do not know how to plant, Arthur. You only know how to harvest." "I can learn," he insisted. Desperation cracked his voice. "I can help you manage this. I can handle the logistics, the accounting." "The books are balanced," she said. "The harvest is finished. Winter is coming. I only cut enough firewood for one." Arthur stared at her. The finality of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. The balance of power had permanently shifted. The woman he had managed, directed, and eventually discarded was gone. She had been replaced by a force of nature. She was forged in dirt, sweat, and absolute solitude. He had nothing left to offer her. His wealth was gone. His authority was an illusion. His presence was unnecessary. He turned around. The walk back to his sedan seemed much longer than the approach. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The car slowly backed down the narrow dirt lane. It turned onto the main road and disappeared behind the dense line of pine trees. Eleanor did not watch the dust settle. She turned her back to the road. A heavy woven basket of late-season apples waited on the wooden steps of the porch. She walked over and picked it up. The weight was familiar. It was deeply comforting. She carried the harvest into the cabin. The heavy oak door closed behind her. The iron latch clicked firmly into place. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth. The leather-bound ledger lay open on the long wooden table. The pages were filled with her own steady handwriting. They detailed her yields, her plans, her future. The silence in the room was absolute. It was not empty. It was full of peace. The ledger was waiting for the next entry. Eleanor picked up her pen.